I had always taken pride in my marriage to Anna. For years, I believed we had something solid, something real. We had weathered storms together, personal struggles, financial hardships, the stresses of work. Through it all, we stayed strong, at least, I thought we did. Recently, however, things had started to shift in subtle ways at first, almost too small to notice. But once I started seeing the signs, I couldn't unsee them. It began with small things. Anna, who had always been meticulous about our time together, suddenly became distant. She used to text me throughout the day, even when she was busy. Little things, a smiley face, and "I miss you" or updates about her day. Now, those messages were rare, and when they did come, they felt rushed, like an obligation. I brushed it off at first, blaming it on her job. She had been taking on more projects and more responsibility. Late nights weren't unusual, and I didn't want to be the insecure husband questioning her dedication to her career. But even when she was home, something was different. Her phone was always on silent. Always. Before, it would buzz or ping with notifications from friends, colleagues, or family. I never cared, it wasn't a big deal. But now, it seemed like she was deliberately hiding something. Every time it would light up, she'd quickly turn it face down, as if she didn't want me to see who was calling or texting. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, we trusted each other, didn't we? Then came the excuses, the work dinners, the late meetings, the business trips. At first, they seemed legitimate. She had been climbing the corporate ladder, after all. But the frequency of these events began to feel excessive. I could understand a few late nights here and there, but this was becoming a pattern. I'd ask her about her day, and she'd give vague answers, nothing specific. She used to love telling me about her projects, the office drama, and the ups and downs of her day. Now it felt like she was hiding behind generic responses. "Oh, it was just a typical day," or "we had another meeting, nothing interesting." No details, no stories. Just a wall of indifference. I remember one particular night vividly. She came home much later than usual, her face slightly flushed. I asked her how it went, and she hesitated, just for a second, but I caught it. She mumbled something about an impromptu dinner with clients and immediately changed the subject. I could feel a knot tighten in my stomach, but I pushed the thought away. I didn't want to believe it, that anything could be wrong between us. But that look on her face, that momentary pause before she answered, was like a crack in the facade. It wasn't just the phone and the late nights. Her entire demeanor around me was different. Anna had always been warm and affectionate. She'd reach for my hand when we walked, kiss me goodbye before leaving for work, and curl up next to me when we watched TV at night. Now, her touch was distant, almost mechanical. When she kissed me, it felt like a formality, not a genuine act of love. The space between us, both physical and emotional, was growing, and I could feel it suffocating me. There was a night when I finally said something. We were having dinner, one of the rare evenings when she was home early. I tried to talk to her about us, about how I felt she was slipping away. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She assured me that everything was fine, that she was just stressed with work. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But her reassurances felt hollow, like words spoken out of obligation rather than truth. Her eyes, once so full of warmth when she looked at me, now seemed distant, preoccupied with something or someone else. That was when the doubts started to creep in. Late at night, I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me. My mind raced with questions I didn't dare ask out loud. Was there someone else? Was I imagining all of this? Could stress from work change a person so much? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? I tried to brush it off. I told myself that marriages have ups and downs and that we were just going through a rough patch. But deep down, the seed of suspicion had been planted. And with every passing day, it grew, taking root in my thoughts, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. I told myself I trusted her, but the truth was, I was slowly losing faith. Every time her phone buzzed, every time she came home late, every time her responses were short and detached, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hardest part was that I didn't want to confront it. I didn't want to be that guy, the jealous husband, snooping around, demanding answers. But the fear of what I might find began to eat away at me. I could feel myself standing on the edge of a precipice, and the slightest push would send me spiraling into a world where nothing would ever be the same again. One night, after another long day of barely exchanging words, Anna told me she would be late again. Her explanation was vague, something about a client dinner that might go along. By now, I had grown so accustomed to her late nights and sudden meetings that I just nodded, feigning nonchalance, while a deep unease churned inside me. As she walked out the door, I felt that now all too familiar tightness in my chest, the nagging thought that something was very wrong. Hours passed. I sat in the living room, pretending to watch TV, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time I heard a car pass by, I wondered if it was her. My thoughts spiraled, going back to the subtle changes in her behavior and the cold distance that had grown between us. I told myself to trust her, that I was overreacting. But that night, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the months of bottled-up frustration, the constant self-doubt, or the way she had said, "Don't wait up with such casual ease." I wasn't going to just sit there and keep pretending everything was fine. Her phone was on the kitchen counter. She had left it there, like she often did, trusting that I wouldn't touch it. But tonight, I couldn't resist. I knew it was wrong. My hands trembled as I reached for it, my conscience screaming at me to stop. But there was another voice, louder, urging me on. I needed answers. I couldn't keep living in the dark, wondering, suspecting, doubting. I needed to know. I unlocked her phone easily. We had always shared our passwords, never thinking we'd need to hide anything from each other. My heart pounded as the screen lit up. I scrolled through her messages. Most of them were harmless. Conversations with friends and colleagues, nothing suspicious. But then I saw his name. Jake, my business partner, someone I had trusted for years. At first glance, the messages didn't seem too alarming. They talked about work, about projects we were all involved in. But as I scrolled further, the tone of the conversation began to change. The jokes became more personal, the language more familiar, too familiar. Phrases that, in isolation, could seem harmless, but together, painted a very different picture. "You always know how to make me laugh," he wrote. "Can't wait for our next meeting. Last time was unforgettable," Anna replied. I froze. Unforgettable? What could she possibly mean? My mind raced, trying to rationalize it, to find some innocent explanation. But deep down, I knew. There was a flirtatious undertone to their messages, an intimacy that went far beyond the boundaries of a professional relationship. The way they spoke, the inside jokes, the casual references to time spent together that I knew nothing about, it was all too much. I scrolled faster, my breathing growing shallow, desperate for more proof, as if part of me still needed to see undeniable evidence before I could accept the truth. There were mentions of dinners I hadn't heard about, meetings that I was never told existed. Jake had written about their next catch-up session. One particular message made my blood run cold. Tonight was amazing. Same time next week? Tonight. She was with him right now. I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to process what I had just uncovered. My business partner, my wife. For months, maybe years, they had been meeting behind my back, exchanging messages that blurred the line between professional and personal. The weight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I had suspected something was wrong, but seeing it laid out in front of me, in black and white, was something else entirely. The room suddenly felt too small, too quiet. I could hear my breathing, harsh and rapid, as I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. Part of me wanted to throw it across the room, to smash it, as if destroying the device could erase the truth I had just uncovered. But I couldn't. Instead, I kept reading, torturing myself with every new message. Jake wasn't just a colleague to Anna. He wasn't just my business partner. They shared something I wasn't a part of. Every time they made plans, every joke, every flirtatious exchange felt like a knife twisting deeper into me. How long had this been going on? How many times had they met under the guise of work while I was home, completely oblivious? I felt sick, betrayed, and the worst part was, I didn't know what to do next. Should I confront her? Should I call Jake and demand answers? My world was spinning out of control, the ground beneath me crumbling as the reality of their betrayal sank in. At that moment, sitting in the empty house, phone still in hand, I realized something had shifted irreparably between us. I couldn't go back to the way things were. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a rough patch. This was the truth, raw and undeniable, staring back at me from the screen. And as much as I wanted to, I couldn't unsee it. After the initial shock of discovering the messages between Anna and Jake, I found myself in a state of constant anxiety. My mind wouldn't stop replaying those texts. over and over, as if somehow the meaning would change with each mental review. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more, that what I had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. I needed to know the full extent of their relationship. I needed undeniable proof that would leave no room for doubt. That's when I started following her. At first, it felt wrong, invasive even. We had been married for years, and the thought of stalking my wife made me sick to my stomach. But I couldn't trust her anymore. And every time she left the house, my heart would pound with suspicion. I had to know where she was going and, more importantly, who she was meeting. So, one morning, after she left for what she claimed was a work meeting, I got in my car and followed her at a distance. The first few times, it was nothing unusual. She went to work, ran errands, and even visited her mother. I almost began to think I was going crazy, that maybe those texts were just inappropriate but harmless banter, that I had overreacted. But deep down, I knew better. I couldn't ignore the changes in her, the distance between us, the late nights that had no explanation. Then one Friday afternoon, she told me she was going to a meeting across town. Her tone was calm, her explanation casual, as if it were just another day. But something about the way she said it, the lack of detail, the way she avoided eye contact, set off alarm bells in my head. I waited a few minutes after she left, then followed her again. This time, she didn't go to work. She didn't go to any office or meeting place I recognized. Instead, she drove to a small, upscale restaurant on the outskirts of the city. I parked a few cars down and watched as she got out of the car, looking around briefly before walking inside. Moments later, Jake arrived. My heart sank as I watched them greet each other, their expressions far too comfortable, too familiar for a casual business lunch. They sat down at a private table, away from prying eyes, and began talking. There was laughter and smiles, an ease between them that I hadn't seen from her in months. I sat there, frozen in disbelief, my worst fears playing out in front of me. This wasn't work. This was something else entirely. But I needed more than just my suspicions. I needed cold, hard evidence that I could confront them with. So, after a couple of weeks of driving myself mad with half-baked surveillance attempts, I hired a private investigator. It felt like crossing a line, but I didn't care anymore. I needed to know the truth, and I couldn't do it on my own. The investigator was a quiet, efficient man who didn't ask too many questions. He didn't need to. I explained the situation, gave him the details, and let him do his work. For weeks, he followed Anna. He tracked her movements and noted every time she met with Jake. It didn't take long before the pattern emerged. They were careful, always meeting in places far from home, in quiet, discreet corners of the city. They never left together, never stayed in the same place for too long. But there was no mistaking the nature of their meetings. The investigator gathered photos, timestamps, and video recordings, all of them damning, all of them undeniable. After a month of following them, the investigator sat down with me and laid everything out. My worst fears were confirmed. Anna and Jake had been meeting regularly for years. This wasn't just a recent affair, it was a long, carefully hidden relationship that stretched back further than I had ever imagined. They had perfected the art of deception, creating an intricate web of lies and half-truths to cover their tracks. All the late nights, all the unexplained absences, it all made sense now. I had been blind for so long, but now the truth was laid bare before me. The realization hit me like a freight train. My wife, the woman I had loved and trusted, had been betraying me for years. And it wasn't just her. It was Jake, my business partner, the man I had shared countless hours of work with. The man I had trusted with not only my professional life but my one as well. He had been there for us during difficult times, helped us through financial struggles, and shared in our successes. And all the while, he had been sleeping with my wife. The weight of that betrayal was unbearable. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like the entire foundation of my life had crumbled in an instant. I sat there, staring at the evidence in front of me, feeling like I had been punched in the gut. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense anymore. How could I have been so blind? How could I have missed all the signs? The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the sudden distance between us. It was all so obvious now, yet I had convinced myself there was nothing wrong. For a moment, I felt like giving up. Like walking away from it all, leaving them to their lies and deceit. The thought of confronting either of them seemed unbearable. What would I even say? How could I face them? Knowing what I knew now, A part of me wanted to pack my bags and disappear, to leave them to the mess they had created without saying a word. But the more I thought about it, the more the anger began to grow inside me. At first, it was a quiet simmer, a low burn beneath the surface. But it didn't take long for that anger to boil over. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional, too. Jake had taken everything from me. He had destroyed not only my marriage but also the trust and partnership we had built over the years. How dare he? How dare they both? They had been playing me for a fool, carrying on their affair while I had worked side by side with him, completely oblivious. The anger overtook the sadness, the shock, the confusion. It fueled me. I couldn't just walk away. No, I needed to do something. I needed to make them pay for what they had done to me. Jake had ruined my marriage, and I was going to ruin his life in return. I wouldn't let them get away with this. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. There was no way I could let this go. The betrayal had cut too deep. It wasn't just about the affair anymore, it was about the sheer audacity, the cruelty of it. Jake hadn't just slept with my wife, he had been playing this sick game right under my nose for years. The thought of them laughing at me behind my back, sharing stolen moments while I was none the wiser, made my blood boil. I couldn't just walk away from this. I needed to make them feel the consequences of what they'd done. And I knew exactly where to strike. Jake had weaknesses, more than he would ever let on. On the surface, he was a polished, successful businessman. He was charismatic, knew how to close deals, and always gave the impression of being in control. But beneath that facade, I had seen the cracks. Over the years, I'd learned things about him. Things that he kept hidden from most people. You don't work side by side with someone for so long without picking up on their secrets. And Jake had secrets. One of those secrets was how he handled his finances. In our business, everything needed to be above board, clean, and transparent. But Jake liked to cut corners. It wasn't blatant embezzlement or anything that obvious, he was smarter than that. But there were discrepancies, little things that didn't add up. Shady deals made off the books, kickbacks taken under the table, questionable expenses filed away in a manner that most people would overlook. It had bothered me at times, but I had never called him out on it. I figured it wasn't my problem as long as it didn't affect the business directly. But now, those little indiscretions were about to become his downfall. I started going through everything. Every document, every transaction, every deal we'd ever done together. Late at night, when Anna thought I was sleeping, I would sit in my office, poring over records, hunting for anything that could be used against him. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Jake had left a trail, subtle. But there. Payments that didn't match up, contracts signed under dubious circumstances, vendors who didn't exist on paper. It was all there, buried in the details, waiting to be uncovered. I knew that if I could bring this to light, it would destroy him. In our industry, even the slightest whiff of corruption could ruin a career. Investors would pull out, clients would walk away, and his reputation would be shattered. I didn't just want to expose him, I wanted to bury him. I wanted him to lose everything, the way he had made me lose everything. His career, his credibility, his future, I would take it all from him. But it wasn't enough to simply gather the evidence. I needed a plan, something precise and calculated, just like the way he had meticulously carried on his affair with Anna for years. I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. This had to be perfect. First, I needed to ensure that when I went after Jake, there would be no way for him to wriggle out of it. I started laying the groundwork quietly. I contacted a few key people in our industry, people who could spread rumors discreetly. Planting the seeds of doubt about Jake's integrity. I hinted at irregularities, never saying too much, just enough to make them start wondering. Slowly but surely, the whispers began to circulate. A few questions here, a raised eyebrow there, it was subtle, but it was working. People were starting to talk. Next, I began compiling a dossier of evidence. I gathered everything I could find that linked Jake to his shady business practices. Financial records, emails, contracts, every little piece of incriminating data went into a carefully organized folder. I wasn't just going to accuse him, I was going to present an airtight case, one that no one could ignore. By the time I was done, it would be impossible for him to deny what he had done. But I didn't stop there. I knew that just exposing him wouldn't be enough. I needed to ensure that the fallout would be catastrophic, that he would lose everything he valued. So, I started reaching out to key stakeholders in our business. people whose opinions mattered, people who could influence the direction of the company. I framed it as concern for the company's future, subtly suggesting that Jake's leadership might not be as solid as it seemed. Again, I never gave away too much, but just enough to plant doubt. As the weeks went by, I could feel the momentum building. Jake, oblivious to what was coming, continued to go about his life, thinking he had everything under control. He was still charming investors, still smiling in meetings, carrying on his affair with Anna as if nothing had changed. But behind the scenes, his empire was crumbling, and he didn't even know it yet. There was a certain satisfaction in the planning, a dark pleasure in knowing that soon, he would get what he deserved. I wasn't proud of it, but I didn't care. After what he had done to me, to my marriage, I couldn't find it in myself to feel guilty. He had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and this was justice. No, it was more than that, it was revenge. Finally, after weeks of preparation, everything was in place. The evidence was ready. The whispers were growing louder, and the key players were starting to doubt Jake's trustworthiness. All I needed to do was make one final move, release the information to the right people, and then sit back and watch as Jake's world came crashing down. I had once considered him a friend, someone I could rely on. But now, he was nothing more than an obstacle in my path, someone who had taken something precious from me and who needed to be dealt with. He had ruined my life, and now, I was going to ruin his. As I sat there, looking over the evidence one last time, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The anger, the betrayal, the hurt, it was all still there, but now it had a purpose. I wasn't just some helpless victim anymore. I had control. And soon, Jake would know what it felt like to have everything he had worked for ripped away from him. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back the power he had stolen from me. And I was ready to strike. I knew that simply hating Jake wasn't enough to bring him down. I needed something concrete, something that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he was guilty of wrongdoing. So, I turned to the one place where I knew his recklessness would eventually catch up to him, the financial reports of our company. Late at night, when the office was empty, I began poring over the company's records, transaction by transaction. I'd always had access to these files, of course, but in the past, I hadn't looked too closely. I trusted Jake, at least, I thought I did. Now, though, I combed through every detail, hunting for anything that could be used against him. It didn't take long for the first discrepancies to appear. At first, they were small, oddly placed invoices, payments to vendors I didn't recognize, and minor expenses that seemed higher than necessary. On their own, they didn't raise major red flags, but the more I looked, the more of these little inconsistencies I found. Jake had been up to something, but he'd been careful. The transactions were scattered, spread out over months and years, designed to slip through unnoticed. Still, patterns began to emerge. Jake had been funneling money through side companies, smaller, obscure entities that didn't seem connected to our main operations. He would push deals through these shell companies, take a cut of the profits, and then hide the rest under layers of legitimate business expenses. It was a clever system, one that I might not have noticed if I weren't specifically looking for it. But as much as I hated to admit it, it wasn't enough. These minor infractions, while shady, weren't enough to get him fired, let alone ruin his career. They might raise eyebrows and maybe lead to an internal investigation, but Jake was good at covering his tracks. He could explain most of it away as standard business practices, especially given his reputation and charm. He'd been doing this for years, and no one had suspected a thing until now. I realized I needed something bigger, something that would hit harder. A few $1,000s siphoned off here and there wouldn't cut it. I needed to make it look like Jake had orchestrated something massive, something that would not only get him fired but destroy his standing in the industry. And if the real evidence wasn't strong enough to do that, I would just have to create the rest myself. Once I understood what needed to be done, I threw myself into the plan with single-minded determination. I would build a case against Jake so airtight, so devastating, that no one would question it. It would all look legitimate, as if he had committed large-scale financial fraud under everyone's noses. And when the time was right, I'd deliver it to the people who had the power to ruin him. But first, I had to make it look real. I started with the existing financial discrepancies I'd uncovered. They provided a solid foundation, a trail that led directly to Jake's questionable side deals. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. I needed to make it bigger and more damaging. So, I set about fabricating additional documents, bank transfers, fake contracts, false expense reports. I spent countless hours doctoring the numbers, ensuring they matched up with the real transactions but painted a much darker picture. I created entire paper trails leading to fictitious companies, fake vendors, and inflated costs. The amounts involved were staggering, designed to make it look like Jake had been siphoning off large sums of money for personal gain. I wanted it to appear as though he had been orchestrating a complex embezzlement scheme, one that had been going on for years. If anyone looked at these reports, it would seem like Jake had been stealing from the company on a massive scale. But I knew that paper evidence alone wouldn't be enough. People can argue over documents and claim they were falsified or misunderstood. I needed something more: witnesses. And not just any witnesses, but people who could testify that they had seen Jake's corruption firsthand. Of course, there were no real witnesses because Jake had been careful to hide his tracks. So, I decided to make some. I approached a few key employees in the company, people who I knew were disgruntled or struggling financially. It wasn't difficult to find them. In any large organization, there are always a few individuals who feel overlooked, undervalued, or underpaid. I started casually, feeling them out, learning their grievances, and subtly hinting that there might be a way for them to make some extra money if they were willing to help me out. It didn't take much convincing. For the right price, these employees were more than willing to play their part. I coached them on what to say, crafting a narrative in which they had personally witnessed Jake's fraudulent activities. They would claim that they had seen him forging signatures, making backdoor deals, and diverting company funds. In return for their cooperation, I promised them a financial reward, nothing outrageous, but enough to make it worth their while. And I made sure that they understood the stakes: if they stuck to the story, they would be safe, but if they wavered, they would be dragged down with him. The beauty of it was that the groundwork was already laid. There were just enough real discrepancies in Jake's financial dealings to make the rest of it plausible. By the time I was done, it would look like Jake had been running an elaborate fraud operation for years, using the company as his piggy bank. And with a few strategically placed witnesses ready to testify against him, no one would doubt his guilt. The final touch was timing. I couldn't release the evidence too soon or too late. I needed to wait for the right moment, when Jake was at the height of his success, when the downfall would be the most devastating. It had to be a public, catastrophic fall from grace. One that would leave no room for recovery. I felt no guilt as I set the wheels in motion. Jake had destroyed my life and betrayed me in ways I never thought possible. This was justice. Or, at least, that's what I told myself as I watched the pieces of my plan slowly fall into place. Now, all that was left was to pull the trigger. The day had finally come. Everything was in place, and the time to strike was now. I had rehearsed every step in my mind, every word I would say, every document I would present. The culmination of weeks, no, years, of betrayal and meticulous planning would play out today. I felt an odd calm as I made my way to the office that morning, as if my body knew what to do, even if my mind still struggled with the weight of what was about to unfold. I arrived early, before anyone else, and arranged for a meeting of the board of directors. It was an unscheduled session, which meant Jake wouldn't be there. He would have no idea what was coming, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I needed to present the evidence without him in the room, without his charming, manipulative presence distracting from the hard facts. When the members of the board began filing in, I could sense their confusion. An unscheduled meeting was rare, especially one that didn't include both co-founders of the company. I kept my expression neutral, almost somber, as I greeted them. I wanted to project professionalism and gravity, like a man reluctantly forced to bring a difficult truth to light. Once everyone was seated, I stood at the head of the table and cleared my throat. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," I began. My voice was steady, though inside I could feel the tension building, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. "I'm afraid the reason I've called this meeting is a serious one. I've uncovered some irregularities in the company's financial records, irregularities that implicate one of our own." The room went silent. I could see the curiosity, the unease, spreading across their faces. I took a deep breath and laid out the documents I had carefully assembled. One by one, I presented the evidence: bank records, fraudulent invoices, doctored contracts. I made sure to go slow, explaining each piece of evidence in meticulous detail, letting the gravity of it sink in. As I spoke, I saw the shift in the room. At first, there had been confusion, maybe even doubt. But as the evidence mounted, as the numbers and transactions started to paint a clear picture of corruption, that confusion gave way to anger, betrayal, shock. It's clear, I said, pointing to the final set of falsified documents, that Jake has been engaging in financial misconduct for years, siphoning company funds for his gain. I do not doubt that once a full audit is conducted, even more will come to light. The reaction was immediate. Murmurs spread across the room as the board members exchanged looks of disbelief. Jake had always been the golden boy, charming, confident, and successful. No one had suspected him of such underhanded dealings. But the proof was undeniable. They could see it right there in black and white. I watched as the head of the board, a stern, no-nonsense man named Richard, stood up and straightened his tie. "We'll need to open a full investigation," he said, his voice cold and resolute. "This is serious. If what you're saying is true, Jake's actions could have massive repercussions for the company." "I'm afraid there's no doubt about it," I replied, my voice low but firm. "The evidence speaks for itself." By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the board was on my side. A formal investigation was immediately launched, and Jake was summoned to explain himself. I left the room that day knowing I had set the wheels in motion, that Jake's world was about to collapse. It didn't take long for the investigation to start bearing fruit. The company's internal audit team, combined with an outside forensic accountant, began digging through the records with a fine-toothed comb. Everything I had planted, the falsified documents, the doctored transactions, the fabricated witnesses, was discovered just as I had intended. The real discrepancies in Jake's financial dealings, small though they were, added credibility to the larger scheme I had crafted. It was all coming together perfectly. When Jake was called into the boardroom a week later, the atmosphere was icy. I wasn't there, of course, I didn't need to be. The trap had already been set. I knew how Jake would react. I had worked with him for years and had seen him charm and manipulate his way out of difficult situations before. But this time, there was no way out. From what I later heard, Jake entered the room with his usual air of confidence, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. But as soon as the accusations were laid out, his demeanor shifted. He tried to defend himself, of course. He argued that the documents had been misinterpreted, that the transactions were all above board. But the evidence was overwhelming. There was too much of it, and it was too damning. As the accusations mounted, Jake's confident facade began to crumble. His voice grew shaky, his explanations more desperate. He even went so far as to accuse others of framing him, but by then, it was too late. The board members had seen enough. There was no saving him. The vote to remove Jake from his position was unanimous. In one fell swoop, he lost everything: his career, his reputation, his standing in the industry. He had been one of the most respected figures in the business world, but now he was nothing more than a disgraced fraudster. The press would have a field day once the story got out, and Jake's name would be forever tarnished. The aftermath was swift. Jake was escorted from the building that same day, his personal belongings packed up and handed to him as if he were just another fired employee. He tried to protest, to argue that he was being wrongfully accused, but no one listened. The evidence was ironclad, the damage irreversible. I heard later that Jake had lost nearly everything. His assets were frozen pending further investigation, his accounts audited, and his business connections severed. Investors pulled out, clients abandoned him, and his once promising career was in ruins. The company distanced itself from him as much as possible, publicly condemning his actions and reassuring stakeholders that the situation was under control. It was a clean break, a total annihilation of Jake's professional life. And as I watched it all unfold, I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. He had taken everything from me: my trust, my marriage, my sense of stability. And now, I had taken everything from him. In the end, Jake's downfall wasn't just a consequence of his greed or his betrayal. It was the result of a meticulously crafted plan, one that had unfolded exactly as I had intended. He thought he could betray me without consequence, that he could steal my wife and still walk away unscathed. He was wrong. Jake had underestimated me, and now he was paying the price. Once Jake was destroyed, once the plan had played out to perfection, there was only one thing left to do: confront Anna. Or rather, not confront her at all. I had been thinking about this moment for weeks, ever since I first confirmed her betrayal. At first, my mind had been filled with scenarios of anger and confrontation. Images of me shouting, demanding answers, asking her how she could do this to me, to us. I had envisioned the tearful explanations, the inevitable pleading for forgiveness, and then the bitter, hateful argument that would follow. But now that I stood on the edge of the moment, I felt none of that. The anger that had consumed me had burnt out, leaving behind something colder, something more final. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation. I didn't need to hear her excuses or her lies. I had seen everything I needed to see. I knew the truth. What was left of it, and no amount of explanation would change that. What was the point of yelling at her, of throwing accusations in her face? I knew what she had done, and she knew it too. There was no redemption, no turning back from this. Instead, I made my decision quietly, with a kind of calm that surprised even me. I had destroyed Jake, his career, his reputation, his life. Now, it was time to walk away from Anna, to sever the last tie to the life I once thought was mine. That night, I came home late, long after I knew she'd be asleep. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that had become familiar over the past months. I walked through the dimly lit rooms, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Every piece of furniture and every picture on the wall felt like a relic of a different time, a different life. The life I had built with Anna, the life I had believed in so completely, was nothing more than an illusion. And now, it was time to leave it behind. I didn't pack much, just a small bag with the essentials. I wouldn't need much where I was going. As I moved through the house, I caught sight of one of our wedding photos on the mantel. It was from so many years ago, when we were both younger, smiling, full of hope. I stared at it for a long moment, wondering who that version of me had been, and how naive he was to think that love was something permanent, something unbreakable. Once my bag was packed, I sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out the envelope that held the results of the private investigator's work. Inside was everything: photos, text message transcripts, proof of her infidelity, the undeniable truth. I placed the envelope neatly in the center of the table, where I knew she would see it when she woke up. There would be no letter from me, no explanation, no goodbye. The contents of that envelope said everything that needed to be said. After I placed the envelope, I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of the house, the sound of the life I was about to leave behind. Somewhere upstairs, Anna was sleeping, unaware that everything was about to change. I could have woken her up, could have said something, anything, but it would have been meaningless. She had made her choices, and now I was making mine. Without a word, I left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't even look back. I simply walked out, knowing that this chapter of my life was over. As I drove away, the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the horizon. The road stretched out before me, long and empty, and for the first time in a long time. I felt a strange sense of peace. I had done what I set out to do. I had taken my revenge on Jake, and now I was free of Anna. Free of the lies, the deceit, the hollow shell of a marriage that had once meant everything to me. I didn't know where I was going or what the future held, but for now, that didn't matter. What mattered was that I was done with them, with both of them. Let them have each other, let them live with the choices they had made, with the broken pieces of the life they had destroyed. They deserved each other, and whatever misery their future held. As for me, I was moving forward. Alone, but at peace.